On to the Midwest region, Eric. One-seeded Purdue and that terrible, terrible player that we touched on earlier, Zach Edey, taking on fifth-seeded Gonzaga. Total of 154.5. This is a rematch of the Maui Invitational matchup where Purdue covered a bit of a similar point spread here and really taking control in the second half of the second half. My raw numbers make this Purdue -5. To me, this boils down to how the officials officiate Zach Edey against Graham Ike. First couple rounds, granted, Purdue dominated the Mountain West team. Mountain West teams have struggled in the NCAA tournament, and they got the best of Grambling State in the second half, okay? How are officials going to call that matchup one way or the other? It's going to be a big factor, and it's truly it brings a lot of variance to the table in its own right. The concern I have with Gonzaga, though, even if fouls maybe are closer to 50-50, does their three-point efficiency continue? I mentioned this with NC State and the high efficiency they've gotten from behind the arc over the last month and a half to 2 months. Gonzaga's beaten McNeese State and a hobbled Kansas team over the first couple rounds. Over the last month and a half, 2 months, Gonzaga shooting 41.3% since the beginning of February, with Hickman and Gregg leading the way. Does that continue? And if it doesn't, then you look at a guy that may be due for some positive regression in his own right, and Braden Smith. He's shooting just 35% from the field over his first 2 tournament games. And keep in mind, his biggest liability is when opponents press. Gonzaga doesn't press unless you go back to some of those matchups against St. Mary's a year ago. So I favor Purdue, even if the officials kind of lean towards more of a 50-50 split with officiating between Ike and Edey. I think they advance. My numbers are right on the button with Purdue -5. What about you, Eric?
Well, the analytics suggest a closer game, and this is a little bit surprising. I think Gonzaga's been really under the radar for a lot of people analytically. In fact, I have Purdue winning this game by just a little over 3 with an over-under of about 155, 154.5, 155. It really comes down, like you said, there's so much variances involved here in these games with Zach Edey. Is how is that game going to be called, and how many bodies do you have on the inside for Gonzaga? And just looking at what they have, who's going to be able to eat up a lot of the fouls, because you know he's going to put a lot of these guys in foul trouble on Gonzaga, assuming the referees call the games like they have been playing. So you got Ike at 6'9", 245. He's the natural foil for Edey, but you know he's going to be, probably get his 2 fouls in the first 10 minutes. Who's going to be able to step up to take that role? Anton Watson, 6'8", 225. Braden Huff. Then you got to go down Braden Huff at 6'10", 235. Ben Gregg, 6'10", 225. All of a sudden, how deep can you go and survive while playing that style of basketball? It really depends on how they're going to call this game. Now, Gonzaga has really just blown up. I've talked about that future, that 85-1 future for Gonzaga. But as I mentioned earlier, just something about those top 3 teams, especially UConn and Purdue, seem like teams of destiny right now. So this might be one where I'm kind of inclined to go against the analytics as well as Gonzaga has played. It's just that Purdue just seems like they're just in another level right now. And you saw it against Utah State, where it was just an absolute joke of a game where they just dominated from start to finish in that game. I'm just looking at this right now and saying, what does Gonzaga have? They're number 1 in field goal percentage. They're top 10 everywhere. These are the benefits of going with Gonzaga. They're 10th in adjusted 3-point percentage, 7th from mid-range, 1st from near proximity percentage, although they don't get made chances up front. That being said, it just feels to me like unless something weird really happens and you're seeing guys like Lawyer and Jones and Smith all of a sudden go ice cold like they did against Fairleigh Dickinson last year, or you get Edey who just somehow falls into foul trouble. It just seems like if everything goes to plan for Purdue, this should be a Purdue cover in my opinion, even if the spread goes higher than the analytics suggest. I have currently 3.5. I think you said you have 5. I would not be surprised at all for Purdue to cover this, given the 5-point spread in this one.
And you go back to the first meeting even, I wanted to gloss over these numbers.
Right.
Purdue only shot 16 free throws in the game. Now, Edey had 10 of those 16, so pretty big percentage of that. But still, also 3-point shooting. You mentioned Gonzaga's adjusted 3-point numbers. But we go back to the first 3 months of the season. They didn't shoot well from 3, and this Purdue game was a great example of that. 6 of 32, 18.8%. Nembhard probably shouldn't have taken 9 threes, but Gonzaga may need him to take that many threes, and he's not an efficient three-point shooter in any right. So it's going to boil down to not only how the referees call it, but if Gonzaga's three-point shooting, that efficiency that I mentioned over the last couple months really carries over. Because even if Purdue doesn't get the calls with Edey, if Gonzaga doesn't shoot well, and even if EK is efficient down low, I would expect Smith to play better. I think he has a better matchup here against Nembhard, even though Nembhard could be a little bit testy defensively. Gonzaga doesn't apply much ball pressure. So I really like Purdue to advance, and I'm not a Purdue guy by any means, but I'm with you. We were both on the Boilermakers to at least get to the Elite Eight